The story begins with a group of friends renting a cabin deep in the woods. This cabin had caught their attention online as a cheap getaway spot. Spending a weekend in a snow-covered forest during the winter months sounded delightful. Our group consisted of 4 friends: John, Sarah, Mike, and me. On Friday, we left the city and headed toward the forest. The air was cold and snow was gently falling. After about a 2-hour drive, we reached the cabin. From the outside, the cabin looked old but sturdy. Its wooden structure, snow-covered roof, and smoke billowing from the chimney made it feel like we were stepping into a winter fairy tale. When we entered, the inside of the cabin was quite rustic but cozy. There was a fireplace, some old furniture, and a small kitchen. John immediately started a fire in the fireplace, and I helped him carry in firewood. Sarah and Mike were busy organizing the food. As night fell, the warmth of the fire and the cozy atmosphere made us forget about the cold outside. We sat around the fire, talking and laughing. It was around midnight when the first strange noise came. It was a faint scratching sound, like something was moving against the walls of the cabin. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with concern. "Probably just a branch brushing against the cabin," Mike said, trying to sound reassuring. We tried to ignore it and continued with our conversations. However, the scratching sound persisted and seemed to be getting louder. John got up and went to the window, peering outside. "I don't see anything," he said, but his voice had a hint of unease. We decided to go to bed, hoping the noise would stop. The cabin had 2 small bedrooms. John and I took one room, while Sarah and Mike took the other. The sound of the scratching followed us into our dreams, making sleep uneasy. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. It was faint, but unmistakable. I sat up in bed, listening intently. The footsteps seemed to be coming from the living room. I nudged John awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He listened for a moment, then nodded. We both got out of bed quietly and crept toward the living room. The footsteps stopped as we approached. The fire had died down, casting long shadows across the room. We stood there for a few moments, hearts pounding, but saw nothing. "We must be imagining things," John said, though he didn't sound convinced. We went back to bed, but the unease lingered. The next morning, Sarah and Mike looked as tired as we felt. "Did you guys hear those noises last night?" Sarah asked. "Yeah," I said. "Footsteps, right?" Sarah nodded. "It felt like someone was walking around the cabin." We spent the day exploring the area around the cabin, trying to shake off the creepy feeling from the night before. The fresh air and daylight helped a bit, but there was still a sense of unease hanging over us. That evening, we made dinner and tried to enjoy ourselves, but the strange noises returned as soon as night fell. This time, the scratching was accompanied by whispers, so faint that we couldn't make out the words. It felt like they were coming from all around us. John decided to check outside again, this time with a flashlight. He and Mike went out while Sarah and I stayed inside, watching them through the window. They walked around the cabin, shining the light into the woods, but found nothing. "There's nothing out here," John said when they came back in. "But something doesn't feel right." We all agreed to stay in the same room that night, hoping the company would make us feel safer. We barricaded the door with a chair and kept the flashlight close. In the dead of night, the whispers grew louder, almost as if they were inside the cabin. The air felt thick, and it was hard to breathe. Suddenly, the chair blocking the door was pushed aside with a force that made us all jump up in terror. "Who's there?" John shouted, but there was no response. The door slowly creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. We huddled together, too scared to move. The whispers turned into soft laughter, echoing through the cabin. It was then that we saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, barely visible in the dim light. Its presence was overwhelming, filling the room with a cold dread. "Get out!" Sarah screamed, but the figure didn't move. In a desperate bid to escape, we grabbed our things and ran out of the cabin, not stopping until we reached the car. We drove away as fast as we could, not looking back. Once we were in the car, our hearts were racing, and we were out of breath. No one spoke during the drive. Everyone's mind was filled with the shock of what we had experienced. Finally, when we reached the city center, we felt the relief of being safe. However, it wasn't easy to leave behind what had happened. The next day, we all gathered at John's house to discuss what had happened. We were trying to make sense of the events. Mike seemed particularly shaken. "I still don't really understand what happened," Mike said, "but there was definitely something there." Sarah agreed. "We all saw that shadowy figure. It couldn't just be our imagination." John was trying to find a rational explanation. "Maybe someone was playing a prank on us. We were in the middle of the forest where no one would hear us." I joined in. "But what if it really was something supernatural? Some things are hard to explain." From that day on, we never went back to that cabin. This experience stayed with us as a story we would tell for the rest of our lives. The dark secret of the cabin would remain with us forever. That abandoned cabin deep in the forest became a symbol of fear and mystery in our memories. We would never forget that dark night. I work as an executive in a pretty prominent business. I won't mention it, but just know that my job is very, very stressful and takes up nearly all of my free time. I do get a couple weeks of vacation every year. When I take it, I tend to go out and spend all of my time by myself. It's exactly what I need in order to recharge my batteries and get myself back in the frame of mind for work. Nowadays, I take my vacations in urban areas. But this wasn't always the case. In fact, I used to take my vacations in the hills. I would rent a nice cabin in the middle of nowhere and then just spend all my time alone. After 2 weeks of this, I was so ready to get back to work with enough energy to last for another year. I'll tell you why I don't do this anymore. A few years back, I was very, very exhausted. I rented a nice secluded cabin and was getting ready to have a nice time just reading a few good books by the fire. I don't want to mention exactly where this happened, but I can tell you it was very far from civilization. I preferred this because I got to see more wildlife, but also it was too far out for any real contact with the outside world. The company I rented the cabin from was in the closest town, over an hour-and-a-half drive down the mountain from the cabin. There were no phone lines or even a radio. The only way that I could communicate would be to get in my truck and drive to town. Now, there were other cabins in the hills in this area, so although it wasn't usual, it was completely possible to see someone out in the woods. A few days into my vacation, I was sitting on the porch reading a book and having a drink. This was around mid-morning or noon. I heard a noise off in the distance and really didn't think about it too much. But when I heard more of a rustling, I finally turned in the direction of the noise. I noticed that there was a person out in the trees. He wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, and I assumed he was just a hiker. When he noticed that I noticed him, he raised his hand and gave me a wave. I gave a friendly wave back. He was the first person I had seen in a few days, and I have to admit, it was nice to not think I was the only person in the world. He walked off and I went back to reading my book. I wasn't really paying attention to the time passing. However, I had gotten through a substantial portion of the book before I once again heard a rustling in the woods. This time, I looked up at the first noise. It was the man from before, and he was in the same place as before. I acknowledged him with a nod of my head. This time, though, he didn't nod back or wave or anything like that. He just stood there and stared at me. I mean, it may have seemed longer to me than it was, but it seemed like the guy was watching me for quite a long time. Finally, he left again. I wasn't sure what to think about what happened. I was slightly unnerved, but I still had no reason to be worried. A guy staring at you for a few moments could be for any reason whatsoever, but I decided it was weird enough that I no longer wanted to be outside on the porch. I grabbed my book and my drink, went into the house. Even though I felt like a ninny doing it, I locked the front door also. The rest of the day went fine without me hearing or seeing anything again. But around 10 p.m. that night, I heard some odd sounds coming from the driveway. Remembering seeing that guy around, I got a little nervous. I went and took my flashlight and went onto the porch. I shined the light around, trying to see if the guy had come back again. I walked around to the side of the cabin and the back, looking all around. I saw some movement among some bushes, and even though I had no reason to believe that it might have been him, I did get a bit apprehensive. I hurried back in the house and locked the door. I have to admit being a bundle of nerves. But I had some scotch and knew I would feel better after having a couple drinks. Well, I did a bit more than that, I guess. In fact, I got so tipsy that I stumbled into my room and passed out. I got up a couple hours later and got up to go pee. I walked through the living and to the bathroom, not turning on any of the lights. I peed, went back to bed. Of course, I woke up in the morning with a headache. I was lucky I was on vacation, so I didn't have to do much. I got up and walked into the living room. Two things caught my attention. First, my front door was unlocked. Second, there was not tacked to the front door. It read simply, "You might want to keep a light on. You walked right by me for your piss break." Needless to mention, I left the cabin that day and have never gone back to the hills that it took place in. I remember when I was growing up that my father used to take us to a cabin that his aunt owned. Our time there was always short, but it was always enjoyable. I always enjoyed hiking and playing in the woods. However, around the time I was 12 years old, we stopped going. When I turned 25, I heard about my aunt passing away. At the reading of her will, she had left the cabin to me. I was surprised as I had gotten older and really hadn't thought of it very much. However, inheriting it made me so curious about what condition it had been in since I had last seen it. I didn't have vacation time, so I wasn't able to go and see the cabin right away. However, about 6 months after inheriting it, I went on my way to check it out. It was nice driving up through the woods, seeing how much had actually not changed. The cabin wasn't set too far off the dirt road. The driveway was maybe about 4 car lengths long. I tell you this because I was able to see the cabin from the street. When I got to the still familiar driveway, I slowed and was about to turn. However, I stopped when I saw that someone was sitting on the porch swing, in what had to be split-second timing, and the guy must not have seen me. I straightened the wheel out and kept driving up the road. I pulled off to the side and took out the paperwork. I wanted to make sure that I had gotten the right address. There were other cabins in the area, and it had been over a decade since I had seen it. However, I confirmed that the cabin was, in fact, mine. After thinking about it, I thought I'd just pull into the driveway and have a chat with the guy. I mean, there must have been some reason he was there. Maybe he knew my aunt or something. Turning around, I went back in the other direction. However, as I got closer to the cabin, I felt my heart beating pretty loud. I was never one much for confrontation. As I got back to the driveway, I found myself unable to turn the wheel into the driveway. I had slowed down, but when I noticed the guy was still on the porch, I decided that it would be best for me to drive back into town and ask for the police to check it out. Yeah, I know it seemed like a bit of an overreaction, and I felt like a total coward for doing it. But best to err on the side of caution. I went to the police station, explained what had happened, and asked them if they could take a drive out to the cabin. They were fine with that and told me I could either wait there or in the local cafe for them. I let them know I'd go to the cafe. The ride from the town to the cabin wasn't too long, really, but it seemed like the cops had been gone for a very long time. However, finally, after a couple hours, I saw the officer I had talked to earlier enter the cafe. He looked over at me and came to sit down. He opened a folder and showed me a picture, asking me if the picture was of the man I had seen on the porch. I confirmed that it definitely looked like the guy. The officer told me when they went back to the cabin, he noticed them and ran into the cabin. But they approached the cabin and eventually had to knock the door open. The man resisted them, so they had to handcuff him. They had to run some information and discovered the man was wanted in California for killing his girlfriend. We were in West Virginia, so I guess he had thought he had gotten far enough away that he could just hang out on the porch without anyone recognizing him. He had been at the cabin for a few months, assuming it was abandoned. When he saw the cop car coming, he figured that the police had found him. He had no idea they didn't know who he was. I have no idea if the man would have done anything to me had I actually driven up there. However, the guy was convicted of the murder, so there's no telling. I always thank God that I was too nervous to drive up there. This story seems a bit typical at first. I am one of those people who has never believed in the supernatural, or at least perhaps I believed when I was a child. But I grew out of those beliefs when I got older. I just didn't see any evidence for it. And when I quit believing in ghosts, I of course was less scared of what goes bump in the night. I rented a cabin with my best friend from high school during my second year of college. We went to different colleges, but we made sure that we would come back together and spend time with each other in the summer. The first year, everything went fine. We went on a road trip. However, the second summer, I was a bit too tired to do that. Finals had killed me, and I just wanted to find a place to relax. Jack's idea was to rent a cabin out in the woods and maybe do some local fishing. We came to the cabin, sight unseen. Neither of us were disappointed, though. The place was quite beautiful, and we had a really good first day and first night there. The second morning, however, I got up and went into the kitchen. I had bought myself several microwave sandwiches for breakfast. Someone had obviously opened the box up and taken one of the sandwiches. I didn't care. Jack was my best friend, so it didn't bother me if he wanted my food. However, later in the day, when I asked him how it was, he indicated that he hadn't taken it. I figured at first that he either did and forgotten it, or that he just didn't want to tell me. So that's minor, right? Well, the second night I woke up because I heard Jack moving around in the living room. He normally slept like a rock and had a bladder as secure as Fort Knox, so I was surprised. I called out and asked him if anything was wrong, but didn't get an answer. The following day, another one of my sandwiches were missing, and I figured this was just a joke from Jack, who both insisted he didn't take one of the sandwiches and that he hadn't been up in the middle of the night. I really thought Jack was just messing with me. That was until that night. I was sleeping when I heard a creaking sound which woke me up. I immediately looked over to my bedroom door and saw that it was slightly open. Someone behind the door was partly visible and then slammed the door. I got up, ran into the living room, expecting to catch Jack after peeking in the room at me. But he wasn't in the living room. I walked down the hallway to his room and his door was slightly open. Looking in, I noticed that he was sound asleep. I checked around the cabin, found all the windows and the doors were secured, so no one could have gotten into the cabin. I had to go back to bed, having discovered nothing. It was tough getting back to sleep that night, though. In the morning, I discussed it with Jack, who insisted he had not gotten up during the night, and if he would have, he definitely wouldn't have been peeking in on me. I didn't suspect Jack was either gay and trying to catch me naked, something he had seen several times anyway, nor that he was some strange stalker who looked into people's rooms when they were unaware. So he brought up the idea that maybe the cabin was haunted. I laughed that off, of course, not believing in such things. But I guess for the first time in my life, I began thinking about it. And by the time I went to bed, I had really worked myself up into a mood where I was worried and couldn't get any sleep. After tossing and turning for about an hour or so, I decided to get up and get myself a snack. Sometimes a hot meal did a lot to help me sleep. Sleepily, I walked over to my bedroom and opened it. Immediately, across the room, I saw something moving. It stopped moving when I opened the door and quickly disappeared, and I heard a slamming noise. I ran over to the light, flipped it on, and when I did, I noticed something that I hadn't noticed before. There was a cellar door in the living room area. I put two and two together quickly. I ran, took the couch, and pushed it over the cellar door before running into Jack's room to tell him what I had seen. Someone was in the cellar of the cabin and had been coming out at night. I told him about the couch. Jack was a really big, muscular guy, and he went immediately and sit down on the couch while I went to the phone and called the police. This was a vacation cabin, but it wasn't too far out of town. The police were there within half an hour. They brought the person out from the cellar, only to reveal it was a very skinny and sickly-looking woman. She'd been living in that cellar for a while, stealing food from the people who had rented it. It turned out she was a schizophrenic woman who had been in and out of psychiatric wards. She was returned to one right after. I doubt she would have been able to harm us if she had wanted to. She was just trying to survive. But it was scary thinking that while we slept, she had been walking around the cabin eating our food.